There are events that occur once and disappear before they can be properly understood. And then there are events that return, not urgently, not dramatically, but often enough that entire communities begin to adjust their expectations of the night. In late 1989, residents in parts of eastern Belgium began to report unusual lights moving across the sky. At first, the descriptions were cautious. A formation that did not resemble conventional aircraft. Movement that appeared deliberate rather than directional. Silence where mechanical sound would normally announce presence. These were not accounts of sudden flashes or distant atmospheric effects. Witnesses described duration. They described objects, or what seemed to be a single structured presence, remaining visible long enough for observation to become uneasy, long enough for uncertainty to settle into memory. Over the months that followed, the sightings did not resolve into a single incident. They accumulated. Different towns, different nights, different observers with no apparent connection to one another. Lights were seen hovering, seen repositioning, seen departing at speeds that resisted easy estimation, and perhaps most notably, they were seen slowly in a region of Europe where the skies were already among the most monitored in the world. This was not remote terrain. It was controlled airspace, civilian routes, military readiness, routine surveillance, an environment shaped by the assumption that unexpected aerial behavior would be brief, identified, and recorded with confidence. Yet during the winter that followed, something continued to appear above Belgium, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a pattern, a sequence of observations that would eventually draw the attention of local authorities, national media, and the Belgian Air Force itself. Years later, many witnesses would still struggle to describe exactly what they had seen, not because the memory had faded, but because the experience had never settled into familiar categories. The objects did not behave as intrusions. They behaved as presences, and for a period of time that felt unusually prolonged. They remained. By the closing months of 1989, Europe was entering a period of quiet transition. Political tensions that had defined daily life for decades were beginning to loosen. Borders that once felt permanent were becoming uncertain. New language was emerging about openness, cooperation, and the possibility of a different future. Belgium existed at the center of this atmosphere, a small country in geography, but significant in structure. Civilian flight corridors intersected its skies. Military installations operated within carefully managed networks. NATO command infrastructure functioned with an assumption of constant awareness. Airspace was not an abstraction. It was monitored, regulated, and understood. Commercial pilots navigated predictable routes across dense European traffic patterns. Air defense systems were calibrated to detect deviation. Radar installations scanned continuously, not in anticipation of mystery, but in pursuit of routine certainty. This was not the wide isolation of desert environments. It was a landscape shaped by proximity. Cities sat close to one another. Roads connected towns in tight succession. Industrial zones, residential neighborhoods, farmland, and forest existed within short distances. The night sky above Belgium was therefore rarely empty of human intention. Aircraft lights traced steady paths. Helicopters occasionally crossed low over suburban streets. Distant engine noise was familiar enough that most residents could identify altitude by sound alone. Expectation formed quietly over time. Unusual aerial activity, when it occurred, was assumed to have explanation. Weather anomalies could be forecast, military exercises could be anticipated, civilian flights could be tracked. Technology had created a subtle cultural confidence, not arrogance, but assurance. The belief that the sky, like the ground beneath it, had become part of an organized system. Winter conditions that year reinforced the clarity of observation. Cold air reduced atmospheric distortion. Long nights extended the hours during which lights could be noticed. Bare trees opened sight lines across fields and low hills. In smaller towns near the eastern border, evenings often unfolded in predictable rhythms. Shops closed early, Street activity diminished. Windows glowed briefly before darkness settled into stillness. It was within this environment, structured, monitored, and quietly certain of its own awareness, that the first reports began to surface. Not as urgent alarms, not as declarations of intrusion, but as conversations. Neighbors mentioning unusual lights, police officers noting unfamiliar patterns during routine patrols, observers hesitating before committing their impressions to certainty. At first, these moments did not feel historic. They felt slightly misplaced, something seen where nothing unexpected was supposed to remain. And yet, as winter deepened, similar accounts continued to appear, not concentrated in one location, not confined to a single night, but distributed across a region that believed it already understood the behavior of its skies. What was beginning to take shape was not an incident. It was a deviation, one that would only become recognizable in retrospect, after enough observations had accumulated to suggest that the pattern itself was real. The earliest widely discussed sightings occurred in the region surrounding the town of Eupen, near Belgium's eastern border. On the evening of November 29, 1989, residents began to notice unusual lights moving across the sky at relatively low altitude. Conditions were clear. Cold air carried sound efficiently across open ground, making it easier than usual to distinguish the presence of aircraft. Yet several witnesses would later describe an absence of noise that felt disproportionate to what they believed they were observing. One man, standing outside his home shortly after nightfall, noticed a group of lights arranged in what appeared to be a triangular formation. At first he assumed distance was distorting his perception, but as the lights continued forward, maintaining precise spacing, he formed the impression that they were part of a single structure. He would later say that the object did not resemble an aircraft attempting to travel somewhere. It seemed to be moving with intention, but without urgency. Further along a nearby road, two police officers on routine patrol also observed unusual aerial lights. Their initial assumption was that they were witnessing a military exercise. However, as they continued to follow the movement visually, the behavior appeared inconsistent with conventional training maneuvers. The lights slowed, then appeared to hover. Moments later, they changed position again, not gradually, but with a fluidity that was difficult to describe. The officers would later attempt to estimate altitude, speed, and size. Each estimate carried uncertainty. What remained consistent in their account was duration. The object remained visible long enough for observation to transition into analysis. They were not glimpsing a fleeting anomaly, they were watching something persist. Elsewhere in the region, other residents stepped outside after being alerted by neighbors or family members. Small groups formed in driveways and along quiet residential streets. Conversations unfolded in low voices as people compared impressions in real time. Some described a dark mass surrounding the lights, not clearly defined, but suggested by the way portions of the night sky seemed momentarily less visible. Others focused on the geometry. 3 primary lights positioned at the apparent corners of a vast triangular outline, occasionally accompanied by a softer central glow. The formation did not blink in standard aviation patterns. It did not emit the rhythmic strobing associated with navigation signals. Instead, the lights appeared steady, deliberate, as though visibility itself was not being concealed. For several witnesses, the most unsettling detail was not appearance or motion. It was the impression that the object was aware of its own observability, not in the literal sense of intelligence or intent, but in the subtle psychological recognition that it did not behave like something attempting to pass unnoticed. Time perception began to shift. Individuals who believed they had watched for seconds later realized that minutes had passed. Routine evening activities were quietly suspended. Windows remained open longer than usual. Television broadcasts went unwatched. Phone calls were placed with an unusual mixture of curiosity and restraint. The experience did not immediately feel historic. It felt difficult to categorize. Local authorities began receiving reports that night and into the following days. Descriptions varied in detail, but aligned in structure. Triangular lights, low, apparent altitude. Extreme silence, slow, controlled movement. At first, these accounts were treated as isolated observations. Belgium's skies were busy enough that unfamiliar aerial activity was not unprecedented. Yet as additional sightings were documented, a pattern began to emerge. What had initially seemed like a singular, unusual encounter was gradually understood as part of something larger, a behavior that would return again and again, often without warning, often under conditions that made careful observation possible. By the time the first reports reached national media awareness, in the weeks that followed the first widely reported sightings, unusual aerial lights continued to be observed across different parts of Belgium. The reports did not arrive in a single concentrated surge. They appeared intermittently. A sighting in one town would be followed by several nights of apparent normality. Then, without clear pattern or warning, similar descriptions would surface again, sometimes dozens of kilometers away. Local police stations began recording accounts that shared notable similarities. Witnesses described structured formations rather than isolated points of light, movement that alternated between slow forward progression and extended periods of apparent hovering, changes in position that seemed controlled rather than reactive. For some observers, the experience became strangely familiar. After hearing of earlier sightings through regional news coverage or word of mouth, residents began looking upward more deliberately during evening hours, not with urgency, but with expectation. The night sky, once a passive backdrop, had become an environment that might reveal something. In suburban neighborhoods, small groups occasionally gathered outdoors after rumors of new activity began circulating. Cars slowed along quiet roads as drivers attempted to confirm whether distant lights matched previously described formations. Conversations unfolded in cautious tones. People compared impressions carefully, aware that certainty could easily dissolve under unfamiliar conditions. Photographs were attempted. Most were inconclusive. Points of light captured without scale or motion. Ambiguity preserved rather than reduced. Sketches, however, became more consistent. Triangular outlines, 3 dominant lights, a softer illumination near the center. Some witnesses suggested the presence of a dark surface connecting the lights, visible only because portions of the star field appeared briefly obscured as the formation passed. Others remained uncertain whether they were observing a single large structure or multiple coordinated objects maintaining precise spacing. Altitude estimates varied widely. So did perceived size. Yet across these differences, behavioral details remained strikingly similar. The lights did not flicker or blink according to conventional aviation patterns. They did not produce the sustained engine noise typically associated with low-altitude flight. And most notably, they did not appear to be in a hurry. Reports describe motion that felt deliberate, at times almost observational in character. As winter deepened, sightings continued to accumulate. Journalists began constructing tentative timelines. Amateur investigators mapped locations in an effort to determine possible trajectories. Patterns were proposed, then revised. The phenomenon resisted simple geographic logic. What had begun as isolated observations near the eastern border was gradually understood as something more distributed, a sequence of appearances unfolding across a country that was accustomed to measuring and regulating the behavior of its skies. Public response evolved in subtle ways. Initial curiosity gave way to a quieter form of vigilance. People no longer dismissed unfamiliar lights automatically. They watched, sometimes for extended periods, sometimes returning indoors with the uneasy awareness that they had not witnessed a conventional aerial transit, but could not confidently describe what had occurred. By early 1990, the accumulation of accounts had reached a threshold where institutional awareness became unavoidable. The question was no longer confined to private memory or local discussion. It had begun to enter official channels, and with that shift, the phenomenon would encounter a different kind of observation, one shaped not by curiosity alone, but by systems designed to measure reality with precision. By the spring of 1990, reports of unusual aerial lights had accumulated to a degree that required formal attention. Local authorities had documented multiple consistent witness accounts. Media coverage had increased public awareness. Questions regarding airspace safety and unidentified aircraft activity could no longer be addressed through informal explanation alone. The Belgian Air Force began reviewing available information. Radar data, visual reports, and estimated flight paths were analyzed in an effort to determine whether the phenomenon could be attributed to conventional operations, civilian or military. On the night of March 30th, 1990, a series of sightings prompted a more direct response. Observers on the ground again reported structured lights moving at low apparent altitude. Some described hovering behavior, others described sudden repositioning. Air defense systems registered intermittent radar contacts that did not correspond cleanly with known flight plans. In response, 2 F-16 fighter aircraft were scrambled to investigate. For the pilots involved, the task was procedural: intercept unidentified targets, confirm visual identification if possible, stabilize radar tracking. Yet the conditions they encountered introduced a different kind of difficulty. Radar systems briefly acquired targets exhibiting unusual performance characteristics. Lock was established, then lost, reacquired, then lost again. At times, instruments indicated rapid changes in altitude and velocity that challenged conventional expectations of controlled flight. Acceleration readings appeared inconsistent with standard aircraft maneuvering limits. Pilots adjusted course in response to updated coordinates transmitted from ground control. They searched visually for confirmation. Cloud layers and darkness reduced contrast. Distances remained uncertain. On several occasions, radar suggested proximity to an object that could not be clearly seen. Then the signal would vanish, not gradually, but abruptly, as though the measured presence had simply withdrawn from the parameters required for continued tracking. These engagements did not resemble pursuit in the cinematic sense. There were no dramatic evasive turns or audible confrontations. Instead, there was an extended attempt to stabilize information. Pilots described a process of responding to data that resisted coherence. Moments of apparent contact followed by absence. Coordinates that seemed precise one minute and irrelevant the next. For those monitoring from operations rooms on the ground, the experience was similarly disquieting. Instrumentation was functioning. Communication protocols were followed. Yet the overall picture remained fragmented. Attempts to construct a continuous trajectory from available data produced gaps that could not easily be resolved. After a period of sustained effort, the intercept attempts were concluded. No definitive visual identification had been achieved. Radar recordings, pilot testimony, and ground observations were compiled for further analysis. What remained was not confirmation of extraordinary origin, nor was it a simple dismissal. It was a documented encounter between trained observers, calibrated systems, and aerial behavior that had not been fully explained. In the days that followed, awareness of the military response became public. The phenomenon had crossed a threshold. It was no longer confined to private memory or regional discussion. It had entered the formal record, and with that transition, the nature of the mystery began to change. Observation was now shared not only by citizens looking upward, but by institutions accustomed to measuring the sky with confidence. Following the March 1990 intercept attempts, the Belgian Air Force undertook a structured review of the events that had unfolded over the preceding months. Radar recordings were examined in detail. Pilot testimonies were documented. Civilian sighting reports were compared against known flight activity and atmospheric conditions. The goal was not to confirm extraordinary conclusions. It was to stabilize understanding. Unlike many historical cases involving unidentified aerial phenomena, the Belgian response was notable for its measured transparency. Officials acknowledged that unusual aerial observations had occurred. They confirmed that military aircraft had been deployed in response. They also stated that certain elements of the radar data and visual reports remained difficult to reconcile with conventional explanations. At the same time, investigators explored more familiar possibilities: misidentified aircraft, atmospheric distortions, astronomical bodies observed under unusual conditions. Each hypothesis was examined against the timeline that had gradually taken shape. Some observations could be contextualized, others resisted straightforward classification. Public briefings reflected this balance. There was no dramatic announcement, no declaration of threat, no assertion of definitive knowledge. Instead, there was a careful articulation of limits, an acknowledgement that even in highly regulated airspace, supported by trained observers and advanced instrumentation, ambiguity could persist. For many witnesses, this response was quietly significant. Their experiences had not been dismissed outright, nor had they been transformed into spectacle. They had entered the formal record as unresolved observations. Over time, official attention receded. Investigations concluded without singular explanation. Files were archived. Operational priorities shifted elsewhere. Yet the memory of the wave remained, not as proof of something extraordinary, but as an example of how complex events can pass through institutional systems without being fully contained by them. In the months following the military response and official review, the frequency of reported sightings gradually declined. There was no definitive final event, no widely recognized conclusion. The lights simply appeared less often, until eventually they stopped being reported at all. Daily life resumed its familiar rhythm. Commercial flights crossed the night sky along predictable corridors. Helicopters passed overhead with the expected mechanical announcement of their presence. Street conversations shifted toward more immediate concerns. Yet the memory of the wave did not disappear. It settled into quieter forms of persistence. Witnesses compared experiences years later with a mixture of certainty and restraint. Some remained convinced that they had observed a structured aerial presence, unlike anything conventional. Others acknowledged uncertainty while maintaining that the behavior they had witnessed remained difficult to explain. Sketches drawn at the time were preserved in personal archives. Newspaper clippings were kept folded in drawers. Occasional documentary programs revisited the events, allowing the phenomenon to briefly re-enter public awareness before receding once more. For younger residents who had not witnessed the lights directly, the wave became part of regional folklore, a story associated with winter nights and wide skies, not dramatic enough to become myth, not resolved enough to be forgotten. Over time, the event acquired a particular tone in collective memory. It was not spoken of with fear, nor with enthusiasm, but with a quiet recognition that something unusual had once unfolded above a country accustomed to understanding its airspace with precision. The wave had not transformed society. It had not produced lasting disruption. It had simply left behind an unresolved impression, a sense that, for a period of months, observation had outpaced explanation, and that even in an environment shaped by surveillance and technological confidence, uncertainty had been allowed to remain. Nearly 3 decades have passed since the lights were last widely reported over Belgium. In that time, the modern world has become increasingly confident in its ability to observe itself. Aircraft can be tracked in real time from handheld devices. Satellites monitor vast regions of the planet with quiet persistence. Radar networks operate continuously, translating movement into data that can be measured, stored, and analyzed. The sky, once a domain of speculation, is now widely perceived as catalogued, accounted for, known. And yet, events like the Belgian wave remain difficult to place within this confidence, not because they proved the existence of something extraordinary, but because they revealed the limits of immediate understanding. For several months, trained observers and ordinary citizens shared the same experience. They watched, they measured, they compared impressions, and still a fully stable explanation did not emerge. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was not what was seen, but how long it was allowed to remain. In modern societies, uncertainty is often expected to be temporary, a problem to be resolved, a signal to be clarified. The Belgian wave suggested something different, that under certain conditions, ambiguity can persist, even in environments designed to eliminate it. The lights did not announce themselves. They did not leave a final message. They simply appeared, often slowly enough to be studied. And then, as quietly as they had entered public awareness, they were gone, leaving behind a question that continues to surface whenever certainty feels complete. How well do we truly understand the skies we believe we are always watching?